everybody, and welcome back to the Deprogram. Today we have with us an esteemed guest, Torkil Lauesen, who is a longtime anti-imperialist activist and writer. He has spent many years in prison for his militant activities prior as a member of the Danish communist cell. He's also the author of many great works, including The Principal Contradiction, Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism, and The Global Perspective, Reflections on Imperialism and Resistance, all of which are highly recommended reading. Mr. Lauesen, thank you very much for joining us today. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your personal political journey?
Sure, and thank you for inviting me for this conversation. Yeah. Well, I'm an old man. I'm just past 70, so I grew up in the capitalist welfare state of Denmark in the 1950s and 60s, at the time of the youth revolution here in Europe also, and in America, you know, with rock music and Bob Dylan and the Vietnam War. But the revolutionary global wave of the 60s also reached the provincial cities of Denmark. When I was around 18 or 19 years old, I was in a boarding school and was introduced to Marxism by a friend in the boarding school, and I was rather quickly affiliated to a communist organization as a sympathizer, and it was a very interesting organization because it consisted of very dedicated and very serious people, and that attracted me. You know, politics had a first priority in their life. So in the next few years, I learned really a lot, both on the theoretical side. We had good lectures and good introduction. We read Capital. We had classes in dialectic and political economy and so on. But certainly also on the practical side, I started out participating with this group in direct action. For instance, against the World Bank conference in Copenhagen in 70, and also different kinds of support to the Vietnamese struggle. But we wanted to, you know, extend this support work to the Vietnam, to other liberations movement, in tune with Che Guevara's call for creating not one Vietnam but several Vietnams. And in that effort, we started traveling around to meet different liberation movement eye to eye and see their work and discuss with them to make contacts and select the organization which we would focus on. And we went to Jordan to meet the Palestinians and Lebanon, and we went to Africa, to Mozambique, Angola, and South Africa, and we also went to India and so on. And we get contact with a lot of this liberations movement. Because already back in, I think it was 66, we developed the theory of the so-called parasite state. We found out, we experienced that the support for liberation movements in our part of the world was limited, and also the support for socialism was limited. As we lived in the imperialist center, we benefited in many ways from the exploitation of the third world, and we saw this as the explanation for this limited support for liberation struggle. So we said that without a victory in the third world, there will be no socialism in our part of the world. So we developed this dual strategy. On one hand, we wanted to support the third world liberation struggle, and simultaneously we wanted to build a kind of organization which would be ready when the revolutionary situation again would occur in our part of the world. The support for the liberations movement should be substantial, and it should be material. We said that solidarity is something that you can hold in your hand. So we developed both, legal support work. We collected clothes and shoes and tents and medicine, and we created also money through fleet markets for the liberation movement. However, we also used different kinds of illegal means, robbery, fraud, and so on. But we made it undercover as ordinary crime, because if we have made a clear political statement, we would have been forced underground very quickly and hunted down very fast, as we were not fish in the water. So due to this undercover tactic, instead of going underground, we survived doing this for nearly 20 years, and we managed to I think, transfer substantial means to different liberation movements. But however, due to misfortunes and also small mistakes in the long run, we were finally disclosed in 89, and we ended up in prison, at least 6, 7, 8 of us, and but to make the best of it, I turned my prison stay into some kind of field study of prison life. You know, they observed me and I observed them, and in that way, I didn't feel like a prisoner, but rather like a researcher in prison life, making field notes and interviews and so on. And I made it into a book about prison life, which I published when I was released. And while I was in prison, I also managed to take a degree in the political science from the cell. The university was actually very helpful. They came out to the prison when there were exams, so I didn't waste my time. So after my release, I have continued political work and supporting anti-imperialist struggle. But I also use a lot of time on writing articles and books. So that's in short.
A very thrilling one for sure. And I would also like to add that in a very traditional communist spirit, when somebody ends up going to prison for communist activity, they turn it into a learning experience where they read and write books and research, which I think is very, very admirable. Yeah. I would like to ask you, because throughout your works, from when you first came up with the concept, you and your group first came up with the concept of the parasite state, and then onward to the Communist Working Group and your interactions with Argiri Emmanuel, you eventually grazed and then afterwards wrote about the topics, for example, of value transference, Samir Amin's works, or unequal exchange, particularly in Emmanuel's tradition, and then afterwards discussions of labor aristocracy and whatnot from Zach Cope and other related figures. I'm wondering, could you please give us an explanation, as you would try to your own countrymen who possibly are sympathetic to socialism but don't exactly understand these dynamics? How would you define unequal exchange? How would you define value transference and these other related topics?
Yeah, I will try to make it as simple. Well, it's important to understand. I think that imperialism has always been a necessary part of capitalism. The colonialism from the time of Columbus up to the 19th century was a necessary for the breakthrough of the industrial capitalism, the gold and silver from Latin America, was turned into money, which was needed very much. It was part of the original so-called original accumulation, which started the industrial capitalism in England. And imperialism has since that time also been a necessary mechanism for solving the inherent contradiction in capitalism. Capitalism, in need to survive, it has to grow. It has to accumulate all the time. It cannot have degrowth. It must grow. It's the only way it can survive. And to sell all these products they produce, they need to have a consumption power. And this has been a problem for capitalism always, to have enough consumption power. It's not a problem to produce. It's a problem to have not enough people to buy the stuff, because the more you want profit, the less you give to wages, and wages is an essential part of the consumption power. So this has always been a problem for capitalism. But to solve this problem, a transfer from value from outside solves the problem, because it raises the profit, and it also, some of this profit can also go into higher wages for the workers in the imperialist center, so they can buy the products. And in this way, they can have this dynamic capitalism in the center, because they can have higher profit and higher wages. And on the other side, you will have this dependent capitalism in the periphery, because they are super exploited. Their wages are actually below the value, so they cannot have a dynamic capitalism. They can only have a capitalism which export raw materials and export food for the imperialist center, and also the transfer of the value. So you have on one side super exploitation in the periphery, and you have a raising wage level in the center due to this colonial structure. And this difference in the wage level, it goes down to the products which are produced in the center and in the colonial periphery. And when they exchange products, in the 19th century, it was raw materials and food and agricultural products from the colonial periphery against industrial products from the center. When then exchange these goods, there is a transfer of value from the periphery towards the center, and this is unequal exchange. So it's based on a difference in wage level, and when you exchange goods, there is a transfer of the value.
Very, very nice and succinct explanation. Thank you for that. I would like to just tack on one question related to this, because the analysis is fairly diverse depending on the way that it was carried out and what things are being looked at. There are several. You mentioned a lot of these in your book, of course, and this just exists in. If people are generally interested in this area and they read into it, they're going to find, for example, Wallerstein's world systems theory. You can have, of course, like I mentioned, Emmanuel's concepts of unequal exchange. You can have the work of Zach Cope and Samir Amin. Are all of these one coherent analysis that work together in tandem, or are they separate parallel theories, all of which are, sometimes in concordance with each other, working together, and sometimes they work against each other? What is your opinion?
Well, this theory or idea of unequal exchange, it came out in in the middle. Actually, in 63, the first formulation was Emmanuel's in 63, but independent of him in other places, it also appeared in slightly different forms. I think Amin formulated it in the 70s from Egypt, and there's also this Manini from Brazil. He also formulated, and Wallerstein did it later, but they have different perspective. For instance, Wallerstein's world system theory is very much based on state theory and the historical development of unequal exchange. So it looks at it from the historical point of the view. Manini looks at it from the way a dependent Latin America developed its special form of capitalism, and I think Amin also was in this wave. You can also mention Andre Gunder Frank. But what is I think special with Emmanuel is that his development of the theory is in close connection with Marx Capital. He used the same methods, and he a critique of the classic, and he also have his starting point is the value theory, the labor value theory. It is this which is the driving factor in developing unequal exchange. So I think he's very close to the original core in Marxism, Das Kapital, and his theory is very close related to other concepts in Marxism. So I think that he is kind of the basic unequal exchange, and the other ones it's kind of supplements and to his way of the thinking.
I would actually like to also ask you concerning your connection with Emmanuel, because it was a little bit deeper, you could say, than, for example, with other writers. I know that you've had some interactions with Zach Cope. You've written several articles together, I believe. But, for example, when it comes to specifically Argyri Emmanuel, could you just give us a brief, historical for general historical interest, how that connection came to be, and then, of course, your collaboration that I think culminated, at least in my introduction to these concepts within Marxism, being the fantastic work, the 1978 work, if I remember correctly, the Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism, which was a joint effort by both sides. But could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, when you mention Sarkovic, it's important to remember that he is 40 years later than Emmanuel. He's one of two generations later, so it's very different. But actually, when we developed the parasite theory in the mid 60s, it was very much on the basis on Lenin, yeah, and in that way, and actually to underpin our parasite state theory, which was a political theory, we wanted to update Lenin's data in his famous book Imperialism as the High State of capitalism. And as we tried to do this, and his definition of imperialism is very much that it's in investment in the periphery or in the colonial area, and then they take back super profit. This is the basic of imperialist economy. But when we calculated all this stuff and tried to update his data, we found out that they could not explain the huge difference in living standard between the imperialist center and the third world. So we started to look on other theories, and this was kind of a huge step because we were so intrigued in an orthodoxy only to look at Marx and Lenin. But finally, we looked at all the new theory which was popping up in the late 60s, and there we found Emmanuel, and we established contact with him in I think 74. We started to write letters and started to visit him, and it was actually very interesting because he maybe had a big impact, and his book was widely discussed when they came out in the beginning of the 70s, and many articles was written, but he has very, very few political friends and political allies. There were some academic people which he discussed with, but he was not a very popular figure in France and in the academic world in Paris. But anyway, we discussed. We had several meetings with him through the years, and we also and he was kind to send us all his manuscripts and articles as soon as he had written them, and so on. And so we developed a very good relationship with Emmanuel through the years. And the last visit I paid him was a few years before he died. He died in 2001. And this was at a time when 2001 where it was a completely low ebb of interest in anti-imperialist theory or in imperialist theory at all. So and no one at that time was interested in. There was very little interested in Emmanuel's work at the time. So when he died, all his papers and leftovers and unpublished material went into a cellar actually, and no one was interested in them. But recently, together with friends and other people, we have get access to his leftovers in this cellar, and we have just gone through his archive, and we are in the process of making actually a digital archive of his left papers, and we will also establish a physical archive of his papers, because there have been a huge interest actually in Emmanuel again. So there's kind of revival of unequal exchange, I think.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I don't, again, I would just like to reiterate, me and all the other hosts of this particular podcast, we're in our mid to late 20s. And I don't know if Emmanuel realized, or possibly you and the work that you did with the Communist Working Group, that possibly 30, 40, even 50 years later, depending on what work was published, people like us from all around the world, would want to get access to these works. And I, up until having messaged to try to set up an interview with you, I didn't know that the digital archive even existed yet. So that was very, very pleasant news to hear. But the work that you guys have done before, and the work that you continue to do, is beyond incredibly valuable for what Sorry, go on.
It doesn't exist yet. We have just gone through the papers, and we have took out I think 4,000 or 5,000 sheets, which will be digitalized, and there is exchanged, for instance, with Patrice Lumumba, and there is exchange with Samir Amin and discussions with Samir Amin, and there are many interesting documents which would be useful. But during this year, this archive will be published, and we hope to establish the physical archive also. So we are looking for institutions to host it at the moment.
Well, we wish you, of course, the best of luck in this work, and we very much look forward to being able to access these documents, both for historical interest as well as for modern analysis of imperialism. I had another question that I would like you to get your thoughts on a bit. The concept of labor aristocracy that differed in the ways it was formulated between, for example, the 60s up until today. Do you think that it is a universal aspect of most imperial core, if not all imperial core countries, Western Europe, North America, Japan, South Korea, Australia, or is it something that is unique to only the absolute quote-unquote wealthiest, for example, the United States and Scandinavian countries, Japan possibly? What is your opinion?
Well, I think it's more or less there is a difference between the countries you mentioned in what we can call the labor historically, how thick the layer is, and also I think the political consequences, and there's also you can also say that there is what should we call the Gulf state of Saudi Arabia and this kind of the states, and there are also pockets in America and in France, which with very poor people. So we have to differentiate a little. But I think in the Scandinavian countries and maybe in Canada and maybe in Germany and in the Netherlands and this kinds of country, what we can call the labor aristocracy is totally dominant feature. But it's I think that my view of the labor aristocracy have developed through the years. If we go back to Lenin and his description of the labor aristocracy, which was, I think, developed in the years just before the First World War, and the split in the socialist movement and the Second International between communists and social democrats. And Lenin used the labor aristocracy concept to explain the rise of the social democracy in especially in Germany, and he said that the reason for the rise of this labor aristocracy was imperialism. But in his more specific description of the labor aristocracy, it's the labor leaders and the leaders of the trade unions and maybe a thin layer of the working class as such. And I think my use of the concept is more deep and more structural. I think that this split in the global proletariat, it was created in a long process in parallel with unequal exchange. This super exploitation of the proletariat in the periphery and the raising wages starting in the second half of the 19th century in England and later Germany and Scandinavian and northwestern Europe, and it especially, I think, developed after the Second World War with the capitalist welfare state and and the rise of especially the social democracy in Europe. Recently, I think there have also been one German called Ulrich Brandt and an Austrian called Markus Dissen have developed this concept of imperial mode of the living, which is the way the broad masses live in the imperialist center, and it's the imperial mode of living is a kind of consumption patterns which include both economic and ecological all unequal exchange. It's a way of living. It's a normalizing in daily acts of production and consumption. This exploitation and keeping the violent character of imperialism at distance. It's not only the consumption of the cheap consumer goods and the foods, it's also the infrastructure which is underlying every day of life, the way of transport and communication, which relies heavily on also material flows from abroad, what we can call unequal exchange, that we can only fly the skies and use energy and resources the way we do because the rest of the world do not do it or cannot do it in the same way. So I think this imperial mode of living, it's also a good way to describe the labor aristocracy. It's less moralistic and it's not like, it's not like treason and corruption. It's a kind of structural way how global capitalism is functioning.
Very lovely answer. Thank you for that. Could you please expand a bit on the political consequences, particularly of the labor aristocracy?
Well, I think we can see it in today's action and how the population in Europe and in North America are very keen on supporting the NATO proxy war in Ukraine, and I think they support NATO so much because they have this stomach feeling that NATO is essential for upholding U.S. hegemony in the world, and the U.S. hegemony in the world is the condition for our freedom and our in quotation mark and our way of life. So this is actually the reason behind the support of NATO. I don't think they see that Russia would attack Western Europe or US, but it's essential to have. It's important for the US to have a system change in Russia and in China to uphold its hegemony, and this is connected to the imperial mode of the living. So that's why there is this huge support for NATO in Europe at the moment.
You mentioned briefly, a former socialist power, Russia now, which is of course a capitalist post-Soviet nightmare state in a way, and then of course modern China with its self-described socialism, Chinese characteristics. I was wondering, could you please inform us, since you also lived through there, could you please inform us of the attitudes towards the analysis that you guys put forward, or similar analysis within the former socialist powers, when the Soviet Union still existed, for example, did they take your work seriously? Did they contribute to it? Were there Soviet writers writing about these concepts, interacting with them, developing the analysis of modern imperialism this way? Or was it purely a effort from more niche corners of international Marxism?
Well, imperialist theory on imperialism have certainly not been developed by the Soviet Union since Lenin's day. They have kept to the orthodoxy of Lenin since I think China have been contributing to it in the 70s and recently. For the moment, there is a huge amount of both academic and political theoretical Marxism coming out of Chinese universities. There's a lot of interesting stuff also about unequal exchange coming out of the Chinese universities at the moment. There's a very, I think, diverse discussion in Chinese academic about Marxism. Of course, Cuba also contributed to the development of unequal exchange, and so there came a lot from different kinds of the liberation struggles, leaders of the liberation struggles contributing to it, but I think that I think the main problem with there have been a tendency to see the various attempts to establish socialism in the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Vietnam, South Yemen, Mozambique, Angola, and now Venezuela, and so on, as failures. Which often, shows the impossibility of the project on one side, and on the other side, the ability of capitalism to adjust and survive on the other side. But I think it's very important to remember that capitalism is a historical mode of the production, as all other modes of the production, and it has a beginning and an end, and the transition from different forms of pre-capitalist modes to capitalism took centuries, and I also see the transition from socialism, from capitalism to socialism, as a long process, and as capitalism developed as a globalized process, the process of transition to socialism is also global. However, it's not sudden and simultaneous transformation. It will contain of many revolutions, and the struggle between capitalism and socialism has veered back and forth since the 19th century, and we have to see it in this as a long process. And to add to this frustration, I think there has also been a tendency to demand the impossible, the realization of socialist ideals in a world where capitalism still have been a dominant economic and political forces. I don't think that the communist movement has managed to kind of develop a theoretical understanding which unite the ideals of socialism with the practical attempts to try to construct them in a world where capitalism is still dominant. And I think this have been a huge problems. And sometimes these ideals have acted like a drug that have burdening the struggle for social change with extensive expectations, and this intoxication have now given a way to a kind of exhaustion and defeatism, and I think this is due to this that you have wanted the impossible here and now. And one of the tasks is to draw the conclusions from all this attempts to construct socialism in the past and turn them into a strategy for the transition to socialism in the coming years.
Speaking of that particular point, very lovely answer, thank you. But speaking of that particular point, what would be the strategies in that case for the modern left? If you could entertain us with the two sides, of course, us, for example, in the imperial periphery, and on the flip side, people who are within the imperial core, for example, in the US or in Denmark, for example, what should the strategies be, in your opinion? At least, or what do you think would be more successful than what we've been trying?
Sure. I think when you want to make a strategy, as I have written a book about it, I think it's very important to identify what is the principal contradiction in the world system, because that principal contradictions determines the future of local and regional contradictions to a very big extent. Of course, there is a feedback and so on, and the principal contradiction also changes. It's not static, but it's very important, I think, to identify the principal contradiction. And for me, at this moment now, I see that the principal contradiction in the world is between the decline of US hegemony, which I think is going rather speedily at the moment, and on the other side, the rise of China and its attempt to construct a more multi-polar world system. I think this is the most important contradiction, and this have huge consequences. I think what we see at the moment is a collapse of globalized capitalism as it have been developed in the past 40 years during neoliberalism. We see that this global capitalism is falling apart. Before we have this liberal trade regime, now trade is used as a weapon. Still more countries, there are all kinds of measures to not trading with Iran, not trading with Venezuela, not trading with China, not trading with the Soviet Union, all kinds of the political and economical punishment, which is breaking down this world system, which was essential for capitalism, and this is a very serious breakdown for transnational capital. They have built this liberal global trade, and they have constructed this globalized production chains, which are now in a breakdown, and we also see that there's a decline in the use of dollars in as a world money. We see institutions like the World Bank and IMF. There's suddenly alternatives created by China and the BRICS. So we will see a division of the global market, which have not existed before, and actually it is US who is killing the golden goose, which have laid gold eggs for the last 40 years. And on the other side, we see the rise of China, and China is turning away from economy based primarily on export to a more national circulation, and we have seen a rise in Chinese wage. They have tripled in the last 10 years to make a huge national consumption, which is also a decline actually in the unequal exchange between China and Europe and the US. So actually, I think for the moment, capitalism is actually cutting over the pipes which have transferred value from the global south to the north. At least these pipes are damaging at the moment, and this is the effect we see with the rising economic crisis. So I think we are into a very dramatic period, and but on the other side, this if we will create this more multipolar world, I think it will create a space for social movement and also countries trying to develop socialism. They will got more space to expand and to strengthen. Like we had this balance also during the Cold War in the 60s. The balance between US and the Soviet Union made space for the Third World liberation movement. It was incredible that rebel armies with handguns could take the power in Africa and also the Palestinians, which also with handguns was a strong force in Palestine and in the Middle East. And I think we will see a similar possibility, because we will have this balance between mainly US and China, and this will open a space for a new socialist movement. The big danger is that it will turn into a third world war, which could end with a nuclear war, and this is the big danger. So therefore, I think, coming back to your answer, therefore I think that on one side, I think even if you don't like China, even if China cooperates with systems that you don't like, I think that support for a multipolar world system and not a support for continued world US hegemony is very important. So I think one should support this multipolar world system, and also, of course, this implies that you should struggle for peace. You should struggle for no more weapons. You should struggle for not use of nuclear weapons and against war and imperialist interference in the world. This is a very important task. I think, and in this aspect, it's important to mobilize very broad sectors, because it's possible to mobilize even the so-called labor aristocracy against war, because it will cost them dearly, and also because the armament, the big spending for arms is also it's also less money for their welfare state. So I think you can mobilize people against this war effort, and yes. So this is, I think, one. So and the multipolar state, the multipolar world, I think, of course, you should support any country which are trying to develop socialism and also socialist movement in the third world. And this also, I think, includes the 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 class struggle in China itself, but in but but in but in supporting the working class in China in their class struggle, you have to be very curious, very no, very, very you have to be not to support a kind of the liberal struggle, which will end up with the support for the U.S. and in China. So you have to be very careful when you choose your partner in the class struggle in China to be sure that they are on the right side. Yeah.
I think we can finish off with two questions. The first one will be a question specifically about the anti-war aspect, and the second will be about your particular work going to the future. But with the first question, the anti-war aspect of, more explicitly, the anti-imperialist angle of this analysis. It's more political than it is economic, really, because it gives us the hope that we can support these third world movements trying to build socialism in the imperial periphery. But how do you think we can best go about convincing a labor aristocracy, for example, of or countries in which there are a larger percentage of the population by proportion? How do you think we can best get them riled up to support anti-war movements instead? For example, in the United States, which is heavily militaristic and still wants to continue its warmongering tradition, in your opinion, at least.
I don't think you can convince them with the anti-imperialist arguments, because they are mostly concerned with upholding their imperial mode of living. I think so. In the first instance, they will defend this, but I think that war, that especially a nuclear war, is a threat to everybody. So you can so this is the threat of the use of the nuclear weapons. I think you can support very broad sectors, and I also think that you can support them or you can mobilize them, because they can see that billions spent on armament is less money spent on healthcare and on soft areas. This you can mobilize them on, but I think that what is going on now is going to be a long and deep economic crisis, and of course, in the longer perspective, the deeper this crisis, this economic crisis is, and the longer it is, the more critical they will be towards capitalism. And in a decade, or with this kind of deepening economic problems, a revolutionary situation can occur in our part of the world again. I think we were very too much optimistic in the 60s and the 70s that the liberation movement could cut the pipelines of imperialism, because at that time capitalism was actually very strong and had a lot of possibilities for development. But I think that the situation is very different now, because I think like the late Wallerstein, that capitalism is in its end game. It has very big problems with the climate and ecological. It has very big structural economic problems, which we are seeing in the development now. And as I see it, US is destroying this world market, which is it's depending on. There's also the huge bubble of debt, which can blow up in a huge breakdown of the financial system. There's a lot of big problems for capitalism at the moment. And on the other side, we have this. If you go back to the 60s and the 70s, even if the Soviet Union was a balancing force, it was already at that time a rather weak force from the economic perspective. The situation is different now. China is not a weak force. It has advanced technology. It's the biggest industrial power. It's the biggest the biggest power in world trade and so on. So the capitalism is in the end game. I think so. Many things can change very quickly in the coming decades.
Inshallah, as we say in Arabic.
Yeah.
I would like to finish off with one final question. This is from my personal interest the most, I guess, rather than the readers, and that's I've loved all the work that you've written and published. I own all of it. I've read all of it. I've annotated it plenty, and I hope to popularize, this work even further through my own outlets, as I have on YouTube and of course this podcast along with my co-hosts. But I'm wondering, do you have any more work in progress, other books that you're writing, any manuscripts you're currently working on?
Yes. I have this. I have just finished a book about the long transition from capitalism to socialism and the end game of capitalism, which I think will come out late spring or early summer. I think, and then I'm working on a paper about the relevance of Emmanuel today and his thinking today, which I hope to. Actually, we hope to when we have established this physical archive of Emmanuel's papers, we plan to hold a conference on unequal exchange. So, and this is a paper for this conference. Yeah.
I was going to ask where best can people find your books to buy them or to read them? Where best can people find your articles?
I have there's a website called Anti-Imperialist Net, I think, where some of my articles are, and then I think there's a outlet called New Left Books if you live in America, where my books can be bought. Also, people can, if they live in Europe or in the third world, you can write an email to me and I can send the books. I have a stock of my books here in Copenhagen. So it's just my name and gmail.com. You can write.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today for this interview. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. And hopefully this has also increased the interest in your work and relevant works on the topics that we've covered, so that people will do their research, because as Aslan said, without revolutionary theory there can be no revolutionary movement, and at the forefront of our economic analysis at this point is the work that you and your colleagues and people you've interacted with have been doing. Yeah, I just want to extend this immense gratitude I have as a young Marxist to the people who are with us, who came before us, who are still fighting the good fight. So thank you.
Thank you, and hope to talk with you again sometime in the future.
Yes, likewise. Take care.